This woman says no Chinese person can walk out of the British Museum smiling. Too much of China's history sits behind British glass. Too many artifacts were taken. Too many treasures left China and never came back. Now, on Chinese social media, this argument always works because it plugs straight into the story in China that people always feel or are taught to feel. The century of humiliation, foreign invasion, looted treasures, a country carved up by outside power. So the emotional logic is quite simple. If Chinese artifacts are in Britain, well, that's a national wound, something to resent and something to demand back. But last winter, the Nanjing Museum scandal shattered the whole story. Welcome to Classified China, where we deep dive into past events in China and give you the whole picture. Today, we're going to talk about something that recently happened, actually winter of 2025. Imagine today, Chinese people are saying that maybe Chinese artifacts are safer in London than they are at home. This Chinese man is standing in the British Museum crying, not because he's angry, not because he feels humiliated, but because he's looking at Chinese artifacts that survived, that were protected. Now, in Chinese cultural relic world, two names stand above the rest. In the south, it's the Nanjing or the Nanking Museum, and in the north, the Beijing Palace Museum. As the paramount safes for Chinese history, both actually recently ended up under scrutiny and suspicion. Let's first start with the Nanjing Museum. Now, one of its most famous treasures is something called the Western Han Gold Beast. It's excavated in 1982 in Xuyi County, Jiangsu Province, and it was identified as the representative work of Han Dynasty gold craftsmanship. At more than 9 kilograms in weight, the gold content is said to be 99.9%. Essentially, it's pure gold. And it sat there in the museum for decades. And then in 2025, internet users began noticing something very strange. On one side of the beast, there were these dark marks. And on that mark, there were spots that looked like copper rust. Now, you wonder, how does pure gold rust? Since, it's been dug up for so long, maybe you would say that, it could be something like impurities involved. But again, this is supposed to be like the key representative of a dynasty or an era's craftsmanship. And somehow it started happening after decades. So either it's fake or it just suddenly started showing some sort of a chemical change that we didn't really understand about gold. So people obviously started asking questions, and the fundamental one is it genuine? Or was it some kind of a plated imitation? Now, obviously, the museum quickly responded to try to dispel the rumors. They said that it was this sort of a normal patina, and nobody needed to make a big deal out of it. Except soon after, the museum shut down this part of the exhibit hall for maintenance. Was it for a cover-up? Now, while this could be speculative, the next example definitely wasn't. Okay, so in 2025, a woman named Peng Shuling went to an auction house in Beijing and saw something that shocked her. And this story goes back to the 1950s. Her family, the Peng family, had been a major donor of a group of artifacts to Nanjing Museum or Nanking Museum. Now, these included 5 scrolls of a famous painting called Jiangnan Spring, or it translated to the South of River Springs. And this was by a Ming Dynasty era painter named Qiu Ying. Now, these were 5 scrolls that are now being auctioned for 88 million yuan at this auction, which works out to be around $11 million. Now, the Peng family, namely Peng Laicheng, the grandfather of this woman, wasn't just a small-time collector. He was a major industrialist from the late Qing dynasty and the Republican period, and he was famous for collecting things like bronzes, porcelain, paintings, calligraphy, jade. And you really have to have keen eyes for these type of stuff, right? They're not like some average coins, they're top-tier objects. And then in 1959, this is 10 years after the CCP came into power, Peng Zhengheng, the son of Lai Chen, donated about 137 pieces to the Nanking Museum. Now, we call it donated, but it's more like forced. So among them were these 5 scrolls of Jiangnan Spring. Now, at the time, the museum director, Zheng, a family friend of the Peng family, they happily accepted the donation, even wrote them receipt-like documents showing that they had accepted it. But again, if they were the same works that we're talking about here, they're not supposed to be in an auction house. They were supposed to be in the museum. So Peng Shuling, the granddaughter, moved immediately to sue them to basically force Nanjing Museum to provide detailed documents explaining where these scrolls had gone. Now, the museum's answer was only making this whole scandal bigger. They say that the 5 paintings had already been identified in the year 1961, 2 years after they were donated, and then 2 years after that, or 3 years after that, 1964, as fake and forged work. Now, because they were judged fake, the museum later disposed of them in 1997. So this is like 30 years later, right? Under the rules of the Ministry of Culture, Museum Collection, etc., etc. Disposed of how? Well, they were sold off for a mere price of around 6,800 yuan per piece, which is like, $1,000. For a transaction that was very suspicious, it was to an unnamed collector. Like literally on the sales receipt, it just says unnamed. Like, that's just not the right thing to do. Any normal transaction that's legit, you probably want to have the person's name. And then the museum issued a formal statement after that. It says that in 1959, this is January of 1959, they officially accepted the 137 paintings donated by Pang Zhenghe, and says the 5 disputed paintings had been judged as fake in the years following that by a group of experts. And then it said that another group made up of different people had also judged it as fake in a separate round of determination. And so if we base it on that, if the museum's claims were true, then even more questions followed, right? First, if these paintings had already been identified as fake in the 1960s, why did they wait 30 years to dispose of them? And second, if they were fake, the museum rules still would have to require separate storage or be returned to the donor. And somehow during this whole time, the Pang family wasn't made aware of this examination. So why would they privately dispose of this stuff and then now it's being sold separately? And third, a 2009 published volume of former director Zeng, remember this is the lady that's a family friend of Pang's family, in the diaries included a record from December 6th of 1962. So this is after the second round of their examination. On this date, Jiangsu province authorities had held an award ceremony in Suzhou province, and Zeng, the director of the museum, personally wrote a certificate of honor to Pang Zhenghe, who donated the artifacts. And attached to it was the list and the receipt for the 137 artifacts he had donated. So that means if 5 of those artifacts had already been determined to be fake in 1961, why were they still included in the donation list in 1962? None of this made any sense, whether that's the timeline or the explanation. And so again, this made even less sense in private because Director Zeng of the museum and the Pang family were not strangers. They were friends. They wrote letters. Their families even traveled together to places like Nanjing or Suzhou for vacation. So if the relationship was this close, why would Director Zeng not tell the Pang family about the authentication result? Which tells me that the 2 so-called exams of these artifacts came at certain points that none of these people were made aware of, or they were forged in the first place. And so even if you look at the authentication receipts that were provided by the museum, they even look unnaturally new. Like there's no yellowing from something like from 70 years ago. There's no aging in the papers. It didn't look like it was even from that time. They look like something they were just made like yesterday, as part of faking the paperwork. Now, officials later determined that the artworks were actually stolen, so it validated the claims of the Pang family, and these artworks were later supposedly collected to return to the museum, or they're still hunting for the rest of it, right? So on December 23rd, 2025, just a few months ago, Deputy Director Xu Hupeng and his wife were taken away from their $1 million villa by the police. And it's funny because that villa, which continues today to be the sightseeing destination, is valued at around 10 million yuan or 1.4 million USD. So a deputy director of a museum lives pretty well. So that arrest instantly became sort of a reminder of a meme that was once circulating online in China. The meme is, the Palace Museum has one, I have one too. Okay, so because the single arrest wasn't enough to shut people up about the widespread corruption of Chinese art stealing by officials or people that work in the museum, that brings us to the next part of the story. Now, in 2024, a Douyin account suddenly exploded in popularity. This live streamer, his name was Tingchuan Jianbao, or Listening to Spring and Examine Your Values. The host was a young guy named Ding Shangyu, and his fans call him Brother Chuan.
还有一个是这个我上搜都搜不到，叫禁停通过。
In this video, he's shocked because, and it's pretty funny because the coin said Jinping, as in the first name of Xi Jinping, on the call, and he immediately disconnected her. So his lane was quite niche in terms of the topics he did, right? Which was appraising antiques on live stream. Most of the time he encounters fake stuff, replicas or just low-level goods. Especially he's good at identifying these ancient coins like from the Bronze Age, that sort of thing. Now the setup was very simple, right? He just get viewers to connect and call with them, and they show him what they've got, and that's basically it. He judges whether they're real or fake. Now, one live stream caused huge uproar at the time. A viewer showed 2 bronze ancient swords and asked Brother Chen to appraise them. And he says that these swords could go to the auction and they would be worth a lot if they were real. But except they were actually real, because these swords legitimately looked like the real stuff. And so that viewer said something even more explosive after that. He claimed that the swords had been taken out from the Beijing Museum in Chongqing City. And then this person posed out several more antiques, of which judges to be real by Brother Chen as well. And after that, this person was even inviting him to visit Sichuan to go to this museum. And so at this museum, it's reportedly holding something like 20,000 artifacts, from true bronze to Eastern Han pottery horses to Song Dynasty ceramics, just throughout the civilization, that type of thing. And one of his signature treasure was exactly a bronze ba sword from the Warring States period. Now, after that, officially reported they didn't know the details, that's the museum, and then police had been intervening into the situation already. The person who showed the sword had been arrested, and this entire thing is still under investigation. So it just shows you that this is not an isolated case that happened in Nanjing. Now, if this was real, then somebody managed to pull antiques out of a second-tier national museum as casually as reaching into a drawer, right? And then, obviously, the bigger name appeared, the Palace Museum in Beijing. A wealthy caller came onto the live stream of Brother Chen and started showing off pieces that matched famous Palace Museum types artworks and artifacts. A cloud and dragon chest, objects tied to Qianlong Emperor's studio of 3 rare works. And this is when things just completely changed. It's what he said.
咱这保养的好，我这3天一保养。
但是这种东西怎么会流落于民间呀？
钱到位啥不卖？
啊？
钱到位他们啥不卖？
钱到位，他们啥什么不卖？
The Palace Museum has one. My house has one too. Now, even Brother Chen looked completely stunned, because how did the real things like that get out? This is the Palace Museum, okay? The rich caller reportedly just simply answered saying that if the money is there, you can pretty much buy anything. Now, at the time, a lot of people in the comments thought that this guy was obviously just buying, he's a rich idiot who's buying obviously replicas of the real thing. But again, when people went back to look after that ba sword incident, yeah, suddenly people started realizing that this guy was actually buying the real stuff. Now they're starting to ask, what if every museum in China, what if every museum in the country is doing something as shady as reselling real stuff into the auction, in turn making money? What if they're laundering art? And so obviously, they're rattled by the situation. In November 2024, Wang Yanming, the former executive vice director of the Palace Museum, was arrested 6 years after leaving office. Why? Well, the official notice was vague. It only said that he was under investigation for serious violations of discipline and law by the anti-corruption authorities. But again, that doesn't really tell us much. That matters because the Palace Museum is not just any museum. The Palace Museum is directly under the control of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. It's the top authority which oversees all the museums in China. So the Palace Museum is like the #1 on that, right? It's a first-tier national museum. The top director of the museum is usually a vice ministerial rank member of the CCP. So that tells you how important it is. And so we can kind of put one and one together and say that it probably had something to do with corruption in that museum row that he was arrested. So if both the Nanjing Museum, which is #2, and the Palace Museum, which is, #1, both hit by major scandals, then the implications are bigger than either of them. We started to look at this as a whole systemic problem. And that's basically how the meme spread, right? The Palace Museum has one, I've got one too. So how exactly do objects from museums like Nanjing and Palace Museum disappear? Well, let's start with the first one. It's quite simple. If somebody in the CCP, high enough in the system, wanted an artifact, they couldn't refuse at the museum. Right? There's some famous examples. Mao Zedong and his underlings, Kang Sheng is one of them, allegedly borrowed treasures and never returned them. Jiang Qing, the wife of Mao, Madame Mao, and Chen Boda, they were part of the Gang of Four, they also were described as taking batches of artifacts home. Mao Zedong himself, according to historical accounts, took at least 3 batches of painting, calligraphy, and rare books from the Palace Museum. Some of them still, nowhere to be located. They reportedly are at Zhongnanhai, which is the headquarters of the CCP, but again, nobody knows where they are. So that was the first problem. officials can just take whatever they want. And the museums look public, but the powers can still reach within and take it however it wants to. And then you have the second problem, which is that a lot of things weren't stolen, they were just ruined. The Cultural Revolution is a great example of this. Red Guards attempted to storm the Palace Museum as part of their demonstration against the Four Oaths, right? History, stuff like that. And the staff, hearing about what's going to happen, they hid what they could. In the second round, after they tried to come back, Zhou Enlai reportedly sent soldiers to protect the site. Zhou Enlai was the premier of the CCP at the time, so that might have saved some of the important stuff from the museum from like a total devastation. Over the years, the CCP kept the story that its most valuable objects were stolen by the Eight-Nation Alliance that invaded China, that the Met Museum, British Museum, or wherever else kept a bunch of stolen artifacts. But the real question is this. Where is the real Western Han gold beast? Where is the real Jiangnan Spring scrolls? Where's those real chests from the Qianlong era? After the 2025 Nanjing museum scandal, more than 30 museums across China reportedly announced temporary closures. That was between October and December of last year. And among them were places like the Jingsha Site Museum in Chengdu and the Shanxi History Museum. So the implication is that when a giant like Nanking is exposed, everybody else gets scared and start looking to see if their own storage units have lost some certainly important stuff. And I think, unfortunately, yeah, they probably found stuff too. All right, that's it for today's topic. Let me know your thoughts about this particular topic. Do you agree with my assessment that pretty much all the museums are, well, voluntarily or involuntarily having people laundering out artifacts in exchange for making a big buck on the black market or simply just real auctions? Thank you very much. We'll see you in the next one.